On Tuesday, Merseyside police announced they were adding 2 extra charges against Axel Rudakubana, who is accused of murdering 3 young girls in Southport 3 months ago. It was those tragic murders that led to days of racist rioting across England and Northern Ireland. And the confirmation of these extra charges threatens to reopen some of those wounds.
The 2 further offences relate to evidence obtained by Merseyside police during searches of Axel Rudakubana's home address as part of a lengthy and complex investigation which has been ongoing since the 29th of July. The additional charges are the production of a biological toxin, namely ricin, contrary to Section 1 of the Biological Weapons Act 1974, and possession of information, namely a PDF file entitled Military Studies in the Jihad Against the Tyrants, the Al-Qaeda Training Manual, likely to be useful to a person committing or preparing to commit an act of terrorism, contrary to Section 58 of the Terrorism Act 2000.
That was Chief Constable Serena Kennedy announcing that as well as being charged with murder and attempted murder, Rudakubana is facing terrorism charges. Kennedy was, however, clear this did not mean the Southport attack itself was being treated as a terrorist attack. That's because that would require terrorist intent, and Merseyside police have said no motive had been established for that horrific attack. But why did it take 3 months to announce the extra terrorism-related charges? On that question, Kennedy said this: "You may have seen speculation online that the police are deciding to keep information from the public. That is certainly not the case. We have been given extensive guidance from the Crown Prosecution Service in relation to what we can say publicly to ensure the integrity of the court proceedings are protected, and therefore we are restricted in what we can share with you while proceedings are live." But Tory leadership candidate Robert Jenrick has clearly sensed an opportunity. Immediately after those extra charges were announced, he released this video on social media.
As the dad of 3 daughters, the Southport attack hit me personally. Of course, the legal process needs to be respected, but I'm seriously concerned that the facts may have been withheld from the public here. The government and authorities told us for months that they were not treating this as a terrorist incident. But today, the attacker has been charged with terrorist offences, and it has been revealed that he has been allegedly reading terrorist manuals. This atrocity was of immense public concern. The public had the right to know the truth right away. Any suggestion of a cover-up will permanently damage trust in whether we are being told the truth about crime in our country. So Keir Starmer must urgently explain to the country what he knew about the Southport attack and when he learnt it. Across the board, the hard reality of mass migration is being covered up. The public can see with their own eyes that they are being gaslit by the liberal elite.
I think there's always something a little bit cowardly about that sort of turn of phrase. Any suggestion of a cover-up would damage public trust. Well, it's Robert Jenrick who is suggesting there is a cover-up, right? Literally he's not, because he's saying, if there were to be a suggestion, that would be damaging to public trust. It's you making the suggestion, right? Jenrick went on as well to make the same argument on LBC.
I'm asking the question, why was this information not put in the public domain sooner? Any suggestion of a cover-up would do permanent damage to the public's trust in the police and the criminal justice system. And so I would like to know, on behalf of the public, why was this information not put in the public domain? When did Keir Starmer know about this? And why did he not speak about it sooner? And it speaks to a broader issue here, which is around public trust in the criminal justice system. I don't want our country to become one like some European countries, such as Germany, where the authorities and the media hide away from difficult cases, don't report without fear or favour, out of concern for community relations and community tensions. That is a dark path to go down. I want the police and our public figures like the Prime Minister to be honest with the public. The state shouldn't be lying to the general public. Transparency is important. Sunlight is the best disinfectant.
So again, I'm not saying the state was lying to the public, but if the state were lying to the public, then that would be worrying, wouldn't it? So what are you alleging here? Right? Jenrick has, of course, clearly been playing politics over this, and he isn't alone. This was Reform UK's leader, Richard Tice.
I think this is quite extraordinary, the release of this information at this time. It's taken 3 months. The idea that they didn't know very, very soon after that horrific killing about some of these details, you have to ask, as you say, when did the Home Secretary know? When did the Prime Minister know? And why were we not told earlier? And these are very serious questions that I think they've got to answer. My colleague and friend Nigel Farage was given all sorts of grief and abuse by many politicians, many in the media, for asking simple questions about what we were being told, were we being told the truth, the whole truth, based on what was known. And it's pretty clear now that, in fact, Nigel, once again, was right, and that we were not being told the truth.
It was presumably those interventions by Jenrick and Tice that led the Speaker of the House, Lindsay Hoyle, to open Prime Minister's questions with this warning.
I wish to remind the House that the following horrendous, terrible incident in Southport on the 29th of July, a suspect is awaiting trial, having been charged with multiple offences. That means the House sub judice resolution is engaged and references should not be made to the case. I know that all honourable members wish to see justice done in this case. It is therefore of paramount importance that nothing is said in this House which could potentially prejudice a proper trial or lead to it being abandoned.
That warning from Lindsay Hoyle didn't stop Richard Tice from asking a question about the case in PMQs, with Keir Starmer being careful to answer only in general terms. Someone with a more thoughtful intervention today, though, was Jonathan Hall KC, who independently reviews terrorism legislation.
I think these days, the difference between whether an attack is a terrorist attack or not a terrorist attack is often wafer thin. That's just because of the profile of people who are now involved in attacks, by which I mean lone actors. The police have been saying, I think rightly, and certainly my experience as well, for years, look, we often have people, and I'm not talking about this case in particular, who are acting on their own. When we look at their devices, they've got either nothing in terms of ideological material. They certainly don't release a manifesto. They're not part of any group. And if they do have material on their devices, sometimes it turns out that lots of different sorts of material. So it's quite hard to say which flavour of ideology they might be trying to pursue. There are cases, it sounds bizarre, but it's absolutely true, where someone has got Al-Qaeda material, someone's got IRA material, someone's got extreme right material. And sometimes all that you can really say when you look at someone's devices is this individual is fascinated with violence.
So Dahlia, as Lindsay Hoyle said there, this is a live case. We don't really want to talk in any detail about Rudy Kubana or sort of speculate on motives or whatever. But sort of on a political level, what do you make of those interventions from Jenrick? I mean, from Tice, it's very much predictable. He's sort of just saying Nigel Farage was right all along. Although, of course, what the right-wingers were speculating was that this was an illegal immigrant. This is someone who came over on a boat. All of these various things which were patently untrue. People are now jumping on this. The fact it seems that there was some sort of document that's seen as breaching terrorism offences. They're now saying, aha, we were right. The public have been lied to. What do you make of what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was a really interesting interview with the KC there when he talks about how the line between violence that is considered terroristic violence and violence that is not is often very difficult. It's very blurry. I personally find terrorism to be a deeply political category of violence. I think if you're going to talk about, ideologically motivated violence, I don't see how, far-right rioters tearing up the streets of Britain on the basis of a political belief that migrants shouldn't be allowed to live in Britain, how that would not be considered terrorism. But as I said, terrorism is a deeply political category, and to act like it's this kind of neutral arbiter of different kinds of violence is to kind of ignore the way in which terrorism has been used historically in a highly politicized way, and is especially being used in a highly politicized way now. I do think it's interesting that, when those rioters in the wake of the Southport tragedy were, again, tearing up the streets of Britain, attacking asylum seeker hotels, even though this case has absolutely nothing to do with asylum seekers, that when in the midst of that happening, all of these media outlets and politicians who have absolutely contributed to this culture of toxic racism in this country were falling over themselves to distance themselves from the consequences of their own actions, and then went on to say, to celebrate the thousands of people who came out onto the streets to defend their neighborhoods, to defend their communities from fascists, after they had said the night before, stay at home, the police will deal with it. It's interesting now to see that none of those lessons had been learned, because there wasn't any sincere attempt to actually learn them. But I will give Robert Jenrick a modicum of credit, because actually he didn't find a need to distance himself from the kind of racist populism that led to those riots. He actually decided to throw some gas on the fire by saying that people who say or shout Allahu Akbar, which is a really ordinary Muslim prayer, that people who shout Allahu Akbar in the streets should be immediately arrested. So, I guess he is somewhat consistent there. But you are right there to say, Michael, that this is kind of taking a leaf out of Farage's playbook. And that's not just because he's exploiting a tragic, horrible event in order to stoke up racial hatred, but because this specific trope of, the police are soft on minorities. The police don't, there's a two-tier policing system. A lot of those fascists were saying two-tier care, that there's this specific kind of softness of the police towards Black and brown people, towards ethnic minorities. It's not just out of the Farage playbook, it's out of like the BNP playbook. This is something that British fascists have been saying, for decades now. And it's incredibly dangerous. It's a conspiracy theory, essentially. First of all, it's just simply not true. Black and brown people are disproportionately policed according to every metric. They face harsher policing at every stage of the process, right through to prosecution. From arrest to prosecution, all throughout that process, you are more likely to be policed excessively and harshly if you are from an ethnic minority. So it's categorically false. But also, it creates the implication there is that Black and brown people are this inherently dangerous group of people, and the police aren't protecting you from it. The state isn't protecting you from it. And then the conclusion to that typically is either that the state needs to be more violent towards those people, and they need to be violent in a way that we can all see and we can all feel. And if the state is refusing to do that kind of public excessive violence, which they actually do, you just have to walk past a detention center to see the kind of, disgusting violence that the state does to racialized people. But that if you can't see and feel that the state is doing enough to protect you from these violent people, then you have a right, a right of self-defense to take that into your own hands. And that culminates in the kinds of scenes that we saw in the wake of the Southport stabbings. And so, to me, this is Robert Jenrick drawing on a long history of British fascism, and as a Conservative Party leadership candidate, completing this long process that we've had of British fascism and far-right politics being dragged right into the centre and right into the mainstream of British politics. And so it's deeply concerning, and particularly in that statement, he again very irresponsibly not only draws this line from the tragedy that happened in Southport to migration, even though the two are not connected, but he also argues that essentially an exception needs to be made to normal kind of behavior, normal protocol around this, which is that when there is an active case, you do not prematurely or cast aspersions on what the motivations or what crime has been committed. That's protocol. And Robert Jenrick is coming out and saying, because this crime, I'm viewing this crime as a Black or a brown crime, then we need to make an exception. And that is at the heart what racism is. Racism is about saying that we have a precedent, we have protocol, we have norms, but when the subject of these norms are racialized people, Black and brown people, exceptions should be made. And those exceptions often look like a violation of the rights that otherwise we are meant to enjoy in this country. And so there's multiple reasons why Jenrick, as a Conservative Party candidate, leadership candidate, parroting these kinds of lines, it is concerning, but it also kind of belies a trend that we have been seeing in the Conservative Party, not just in the past couple of years, but that kind of the creep, the fascism creep of the far right into the Conservative Party has long been a problem that we have been grappling with in this country.